The Whitmore and Ashford families had known each other for so many years that no one remembered exactly where the friendship had begun. Perhaps it had started with business. Perhaps with childhood neighbors becoming lifelong companions. Whatever the reason, both families moved through each other's lives with a natural familiarity that felt permanent. Elena Whitmore had grown up seeing Adrian Ashford at birthdays, holiday dinners, summer gatherings, and grand celebrations. There had never been a moment of introduction because, in Elena's memories, Adrian had simply always existed. When she was 8 years old, she thought he was the most extraordinary boy she had ever seen. Not because he was handsome, children rarely understood beauty in that way, but because he was fearless. She remembered watching him climb a large oak tree in his parents' garden while adults shouted warnings from below. "Adrian, get down before you break your neck," his mother had called. Instead of climbing down, he had climbed higher. Elena remembered standing beneath the tree, clutching the edges of her dress nervously. Then Adrian had looked down and grinned. "Don't worry, I won't fall." And somehow, strangely, she had believed him. Years later, she would realize that had been the beginning. Not love, not then, but the beginning of watching him. The beginning of caring. And eventually, caring had quietly become everything. As children became teenagers and teenagers slowly became adults, Adrian changed in ways people expected him to. He became taller, more confident, more handsome. People naturally turned toward him in crowded rooms. He possessed the kind of effortless charm some people spent entire lives trying to learn. He excelled in school, succeeded in sports, succeeded in conversations, succeeded in nearly everything he touched. And Elena remained herself, gentle, quiet, observant. While Adrian occupied the center of every room, Elena preferred standing near windows, watching sunlight spill across polished floors. While Adrian talked, Elena listened. While Adrian chased excitement, Elena noticed details. She remembered things people forgot. Small things, tiny things, things that somehow mattered. She remembered Adrian hated cinnamon in his coffee. She remembered he became quiet whenever he was troubled. She remembered he always loosened his tie after stressful meetings. She remembered he smiled differently when he was genuinely happy. No one had taught her these things. Years of loving him had simply taught her to notice. Of course, Adrian never knew. Elena had become very skilled at hiding her feelings. At first, she thought they would disappear. People always said first loves faded. People said feelings changed. People said time solved everything. But years passed, and instead of disappearing, her feelings grew roots. Deep ones, quiet ones, the kind that wrapped around the heart slowly enough that you didn't realize they were there until they became impossible to remove. By the time Elena was 25, loving Adrian had become as natural as breathing. She no longer questioned it. She simply lived with it. She carried it like a secret folded carefully into her chest. Some days it hurt. Most days she ignored it. And sometimes Adrian smiled at her, and suddenly loving him felt like the easiest thing in the world. One winter evening, both families attended a charity gala held in a luxurious hotel ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Music drifted softly through the room. Elegant guests moved beneath golden light with glasses of champagne in hand. Elena stood near a marble pillar wearing a dark blue evening gown while watching guests dance. She had spent nearly 20 minutes pretending to be interested in the floral decorations because Adrian had arrived with someone. Again, the woman beside him was beautiful, tall, elegant, perfectly styled. Elena hated herself a little for noticing. She hated herself more for feeling disappointed. She lowered her eyes and looked down at her untouched drink. "Why are you hiding over here?" Her heart reacted before her mind did. Adrian, of course, always Adrian. She looked up. He stood beside her wearing a black suit with his tie slightly loosened already. His expression looked tired. Elena smiled gently. "I'm not hiding. You are." "No, I'm not." "You absolutely are." She laughed softly. Adrian stared at her for a moment. "What?" She blinked. What? Nothing." But he continued looking at her. Then he shook his head. "Come with me." "Where?" "Outside." Before she could ask more questions, Adrian had already started walking. Elena followed him. Naturally, she always did. Cold winter air greeted them outside the ballroom. The city lights stretched beneath the night sky like stars scattered across the earth. Adrian leaned against the railing and sighed deeply. For several moments, neither spoke. Elena looked at him carefully. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Something deeper. "What happened?" she finally asked. Adrian glanced sideways. "What makes you think something happened?" She smiled. "You keep rubbing your forehead." He stared at her, then laughed quietly. "How do you notice these things?" Elena looked away. "Because I notice everything about you. Because I've spent years noticing. Because loving you taught me how." Instead, she shrugged. "I don't know." Adrian looked toward the city. The investors' meeting today was a disaster. His voice carried frustration. "I spent 6 months on that project." Elena listened quietly. Adrian spoke for nearly 15 minutes. About stress. About problems. About disappointments. And Elena simply listened. She never interrupted. Never forced solutions. Never tried fixing things. She just sat beside him. When Adrian finally stopped talking, silence settled around them. Then he looked at her and smiled. Not his social smile. Not his charming smile. His real one. The one she secretly treasured. "You always know exactly what I need." Her chest tightened. Dangerously. Because Adrian said things like that without understanding what they did to her. Because Adrian trusted her. Needed her. Relied on her. But never in the way she wanted. Elena smiled anyway. "I'm glad." Adrian looked at her for a moment before standing. "Come on." "Where?" "Dance with me." Her eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me. I don't dance." "You do dance." "I really don't." He held out his hand. "Elena." There was amusement in his eyes. There always was when he looked at her. She stared at his hand, then placed her own into it. Because of course she did. Inside the ballroom, they moved slowly among other couples. Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Adrian looked perfectly relaxed. Unfairly relaxed. "You're nervous," he said. "I'm not." "You are." "I'm not." He laughed. Elena stared at him. At his eyes. At the familiar curve of his smile. And for one dangerous second, she allowed herself to imagine impossible things. What if someday? What if one day? What if he looked at her differently? What if after all these years he finally saw her? Then Adrian suddenly spoke. "Oh, I forgot to tell you." Her heart dropped instantly. Because she knew that tone. She knew it. "Catherine and I are going away next weekend." There it was. Reality. Simple. Cold reality. Elena smiled because she had learned how. "Oh, yeah." He seemed happy, excited. Elena hated that tiny ache inside her chest. Hated it. Because Adrian had done nothing wrong. He had never promised her anything. Never led her on. Never asked her to wait. This pain belonged entirely to her. Entirely. She carried it home herself. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. And somehow nothing changed. Adrian dated women. Elena smiled through heartbreak. Adrian called when life became difficult. Elena answered. Adrian needed support. Elena appeared. Always. 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 Until one evening during a family celebration dinner, something happened. Not something dramatic. Not some terrible betrayal. Sometimes hearts change from very small moments. Everyone sat around a long dining table laughing over stories and old memories. Adrian sat beside Elena, as usual. At one point his mother laughed. "You two spend more time together than married couples do." People smiled. Someone joked about them eventually ending up together. Elena felt warmth rise into her face. But Adrian laughed casually. Then he threw an arm around Elena's shoulder. "You know, Elena will always be in my life." Always. Such a simple sentence. Such harmless words. Everyone smiled. Everyone continued eating. But Elena sat very still. Because suddenly she understood something she had spent years refusing to see. Always. She would always be there. Always available. Always waiting. Always loving. Always giving. But never chosen. Never first. Never his. The realization arrived quietly. No thunder. No shattered glass. No dramatic heartbreak. Just a tiny crack. Small. Silent. But deep enough that for the first time in years, Something inside Elena Whitmore began to break. They imagined tears falling dramatically in empty rooms. They imagined desperate confessions, slammed doors, and unbearable sorrow. But Elena discovered that sometimes hearts changed quietly. Quietly enough that no one else noticed. Not even the person responsible. After that family dinner, life continued exactly as it always had. The sun still rose every morning. People still laughed at dinners. Adrian still called her unexpectedly. Nothing around her had changed. Only Elena had. At first, the difference was so small she barely noticed it herself. 3 days after the dinner, Adrian called while she was arranging flowers near her apartment window. She looked at his name glowing on her phone. Normally, she answered immediately. Always immediately. Instead, she stared at it for several seconds. Her fingers hesitated. Then she answered, "Hello, Elena." His voice sounded familiar and comfortable. Dangerously comfortable. "What are you doing?" "Nothing important. I just escaped a 3-hour meeting." She smiled weakly. "Congratulations. I deserve a medal." She laughed softly. For several moments, he spoke about work frustrations and difficult clients. Elena listened, as always, but something felt strange. For years, she had listened while secretly holding onto every word, every laugh, every pause. Today, she simply listened. No excitement, no hidden hope, just listening. Adrian suddenly stopped speaking. "You're quiet." "I'm listening. You usually say more." Elena looked out her window. Sunlight covered nearby rooftops. "I guess I'm tired." There was a pause. A very small pause. "Oh." Then he laughed. "Get some rest." After hanging up, Elena stared at the phone in her hand. A strange emptiness settled inside her. Not sadness. Not exactly. More like standing in a room after removing furniture that had been there for years. The space felt unfamiliar. Too open. Too quiet. Weeks passed. Elena slowly began changing things she had neglected. Things she had once loved. Things she had forgotten while building her life around someone else. One Saturday morning, she walked into the storage room of her apartment and found old painting supplies hidden beneath boxes. Dust covered everything. Brushes, canvases, small bottles of paint. For several moments, she stared. She remembered being younger. Remembered spending entire afternoons painting skies and flowers and streets and oceans. Then life happened. Responsibilities happened. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped. She wasn't sure when. She sat cross-legged on the floor and laughed softly. That's depressing. Hours later, she painted again. At first it felt awkward, then natural, then wonderful. Colors slowly covered empty canvas. For the first time in months. No, for the first time in years. Elena felt unexpectedly light. Days later, Adrian called again. "Come have dinner." She looked down at paint covering her fingers. "I can't tonight." Silence. "You can't." She almost smiled. Adrian sounded genuinely confused. "No. What are you doing?" "I'm busy." "Busy doing what?" Elena leaned back in her chair. She blinked. Because Adrian had never asked that before. Not really. Because she had always been available. Always free. Always there. "I'm painting." Silence again. Then, "You're painting?" "Yes." "You still do that?" Elena laughed softly. Apparently, even Adrian had forgotten. "Apparently, I do." Another pause. Then he said slowly, "Huh." That single sound felt strangely significant. Because Adrian sounded as though he had suddenly realized there were parts of Elena he had never actually seen. Weeks continued passing. Elena started saying no occasionally. Not often. Just enough. She declined last-minute invitations. Stopped canceling her plans for Adrian. Stopped waiting for texts. Stopped checking her phone repeatedly. Stopped asking herself where he was. And little by little, she began feeling peaceful. Meanwhile, Adrian felt increasingly irritated. At first, he couldn't understand why. One afternoon, he sat in his office, staring at his phone. No messages. Nothing from Elena. Strange. Usually by now, she would have sent something. A funny picture. A reminder about dinner with family. Something. He frowned, then shook his head. Ridiculous. Why was he even thinking about it? He placed the phone aside. 5 minutes later, he picked it back up. Still nothing. "Seriously?" he muttered. His assistant walked into the office. "Everything okay?" Adrian looked up immediately. "Fine," but he sounded annoyed, because for some reason Elena's silence bothered him, far more than it should. A month later, both families attended an art exhibition organized by Charity Foundation. Elena almost didn't go, but her mother insisted. "You've barely attended anything lately." So she went. The gallery was elegant and bright. Large paintings covered white walls while guests moved around quietly with drinks in hand. Elena wore a dark green dress and had left her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked relaxed, happy, different. She was studying a landscape painting when a voice beside her spoke. "You've been staring at this painting for 3 minutes." She looked up. The man beside her smiled. Warm eyes, easy smile, comfortable presence. "I'm trying to understand it," Elena said. He tilted his head. "Or pretending to understand it?" She laughed unexpectedly. "Maybe pretending. Good. I was worried I was the only fraud here." She laughed again. His name was Lucas Bennett, an architect invited through mutual friends. Conversation with him felt easy. There was no effort, no nervousness, no careful guarding of emotions. He asked questions and actually waited for answers. He listened, really listened. At one point, he glanced toward her untouched drink. "You don't like sparkling water." Elena blinked. "What? You've made that face 3 times." "What face?" "That face." He imitated her expression. Elena burst into laughter. Real laughter. Open laughter. The kind that made her eyes shine. Across the room, Adrian had just entered and froze, because for a moment he didn't recognize what he was seeing. Elena stood beside a man he had never met. Laughing. Really laughing. Not polite laughter. Not quiet laughter. Happy laughter. Adrian stared. Something unpleasant twisted inside his chest. Strange. Very strange. He walked toward them. "Elena." She turned. "Oh, Adrian." Just Adrian. No bright smile. No immediate warmth. No eyes lighting up. Just surprise. His gaze moved toward Lucas. "And you are?" Lucas extended his hand casually. "Lucas Bennett." Adrian shook it. Briefly. Very briefly. Then he looked toward Elena again. "You didn't tell me you were coming tonight." Elena frowned slightly. "I didn't know I needed to." Something tightened inside Adrian. Because she was right. Of course she was right. But still, something felt wrong. Very wrong. The rest of the evening, Adrian kept noticing them. Talking, laughing, walking together. At one point, Lucas leaned closer while Elena spoke. And Adrian suddenly realized he wasn't listening to the conversation happening directly in front of him anymore. He was staring, watching, waiting. His irritation slowly became something worse. Something uncomfortable. Jealousy. No, not jealousy. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. He was just concerned. Protective. Yes, that was all. But later that night, he saw Lucas brush a strand of hair away from Elena's face. Very casually, very naturally, and Adrian nearly crushed the glass in his hand. 3 days later, Adrian called Elena. "I'm outside your apartment." "What?" "Come down." Elena blinked at her phone. She looked around at art supplies spread across her living room floor. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Then why are you here?" Silence. Actual silence. Then Adrian said, "I just thought we could get coffee." Elena frowned. "Coffee? On a random Tuesday? Strange. Very strange." "I'm sorry." "What?" "I'm busy tonight." Silence. Long silence. Then, "Oh." Something about his voice sounded off. "I'll talk to you later." The line disconnected. Elena stared at her phone. Meanwhile, Adrian sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. Busy. Busy. Again. Why was she always busy now? Why did he suddenly hate hearing those words? Why did something feel missing? Why did he feel restless all the time? And then a frightening realization slowly settled over him. He tried remembering the last time Elena had looked at him the way she used to. With warmth. With softness. With that quiet affection in her eyes. He searched through memory after memory. Dinner. Coffee. Phone calls. Family gatherings. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And suddenly Adrian felt cold. Because he couldn't remember. Couldn't remember when it had disappeared. Couldn't remember when Elena Whitmore had stopped looking at him with love in her eyes. And for reasons he still couldn't understand. He hated that feeling more than anything. Adrian Ashford had always believed he understood himself. He knew what he wanted. He knew what he disliked. He knew how to make decisions. His entire life had been built on certainty. People admired that about him. Business partners trusted him because he rarely hesitated. Friends depended on him because he always appeared composed. Even during difficult moments, Adrian carried himself with quiet confidence. But now he felt like a man standing in the middle of unfamiliar territory. Because for the first time in years, something in his life felt out of place. And he couldn't fix it, no matter what he did, no matter how much he tried pretending otherwise. Elena's absence followed him everywhere. Not physically, something stranger, something worse. It existed in small moments. He would finish a long meeting and instinctively reach for his phone, then pause. Because Elena hadn't texted, he would pass cafes they used to visit and think, Elena likes that place. He would hear a joke and suddenly think. She would laugh at that. Then silence would arrive. Heavy silence. And the strangest part was realizing he had never noticed how deeply Elena had woven herself into his everyday life. Not because she demanded space, because she had quietly become part of it, like sunlight entering a room every morning. People rarely thanked sunlight. People simply expected it, until one day it disappeared. Weeks passed, and Adrian became increasingly restless. He started creating excuses, ridiculous excuses, transparent excuses. One afternoon, he stood outside Elena's apartment carrying coffee. When she opened the door, surprise crossed her face. Adrian, he raised the cups awkwardly. I was nearby. Elena looked behind him, then back at him. You drove 40 minutes. He blinked. What? My apartment is nowhere near your office. Silence. Absolute silence. Adrian looked offended. I could drive wherever I want. Elena stared at him, then unexpectedly laughed. Actually laughed. Not in a cruel way. Not mocking him. Just amused. And somehow that made things worse. Because Adrian suddenly realized he had become obvious. Painfully obvious. Do you want to come in? She asked. He nodded immediately. Too quickly. Way too quickly. Inside her apartment, he looked around. And frowned. Because things were different. Paintings leaned against walls. Canvases sat near windows. Fresh flowers decorated tables. Color seemed everywhere. The apartment felt warmer. Livelier. Happier. Adrian looked around slowly. You changed things. Elena glanced around. Oh, she smiled. I guess I did. Adrian stared at her, and suddenly something uncomfortable settled inside his chest. Because he had never seen this version of Elena before. Or maybe she had always existed. Maybe he simply never looked closely enough. The worst part came later. Lucas. Adrian tried disliking Lucas. Really tried. But Lucas made it difficult. He was kind, polite, thoughtful, infuriatingly thoughtful. During family gatherings or events, Adrian found himself repeatedly watching the two together. Lucas remembered Elena's favorite desserts. Lucas noticed when she looked tired. Lucas listened when she spoke. Lucas looked at her like she mattered. And Adrian hated himself for noticing. One evening he arrived at a restaurant for dinner with mutual friends, then stopped walking. Elena sat beside Lucas, laughing. Again, always laughing lately. Lucas said something. Elena touched his arm while smiling. Small gesture. Meaningless. Completely meaningless. Yet Adrian felt something violent twist inside his chest. Jealousy. Actual jealousy. No excuses now. No pretending. No hiding behind concern. Jealousy. Pure and ugly. The realization hit him so suddenly that he almost laughed. Because it was absurd. Completely absurd. Why now? Why after all these years? Why after Elena stopped loving him? His thoughts suddenly returned to hundreds of moments. Elena waiting for him outside meetings. Elena remembering birthdays. Elena bringing coffee exactly how he liked it. Elena appearing whenever he needed someone. Elena. 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 Always Elena. His chest tightened painfully, because suddenly he understood something terrifying. He had spent years receiving love he never even noticed. Years. And now that it was gone, he felt like he couldn't breathe. Days later, Adrian called Elena. "I need to see you." Silence. Then, "Is everything okay?" "No." Pause. "Come meet me." They met in a quiet park near sunset. Golden light stretched through trees while cool wind moved softly around them. Elena arrived wearing a cream-colored coat. Her hair moved gently in the breeze. For several moments, Adrian simply stared, because he suddenly couldn't understand how he had missed her for so long. How had he looked at her for years and seen only comfort, only familiarity? How had he missed this? Elena frowned slightly. "Adrian," he swallowed. Suddenly words disappeared. For a man who had always known exactly what to say. Nothing came. Nothing. Elena looked worried. "What happened?" Adrian laughed weakly. "I don't know." She stared. "What?" He looked away briefly before speaking. "I think something's wrong with me." Elena blinked. "What does that mean?" He ran a hand through his hair. Frustration crossed his face, because feelings made no sense. Feelings refused logic. Feelings ignored timing. "I can't sleep." Silence. "I keep thinking about you." Elena's expression changed slightly. Very slightly. "I keep wondering where you are." He laughed bitterly. "I hate Lucas." Elena stared. "What?" "I hate him." "Adrian, I hate him because you smile at him." Silence. The world suddenly felt still. Even wind seemed to stop. Adrian looked directly into her eyes and finally said the truth. The truth he had spent weeks running from. "No." His voice became quieter. "Weeks? No. Years. I love you." Elena froze. Adrian stepped closer. "I love you." His eyes held desperation now. Real desperation. "I think I've loved you all along." Silence. Long silence. Elena stared at him. And Adrian waited. Because for years, he had never needed to wait. Elena had always been there. Always ready. Always loving. But now he waited. Finally, Elena spoke. Very softly. "No." The word barely reached him. Adrian stared. "What?" Tears slowly filled Elena's eyes. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. Painful ones. "You didn't love me." Her voice shook slightly. "You loved being loved." Adrian felt his chest tighten. "You loved knowing someone would always stay." Silence. "You loved knowing someone would always choose you." Each word struck harder, because somewhere deep inside, he knew she was right. Elena looked away. "For years I waited for you." Her eyes glistened. "For years I hoped." Adrian couldn't speak. "For years I watched you love other people while pretending I was okay." Her voice broke. "And then one day I got tired." Silence surrounded them. Painful silence. Adrian felt something inside him collapse. Because he remembered everything. Everything. Every ignored look. Every delayed realization. Every time she had quietly loved him while he stood blind beside her. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Ashford understood regret. Real regret. The kind that arrived too late. Months passed. Adrian didn't disappear. But he stopped chasing dramatically. Stopped making grand speeches. Stopped trying to force feelings. Instead, he changed. Quietly. The same way Elena had once loved him. He remembered things. Showed up. Listened. Waited. He gave without expecting. And slowly Elena noticed. Very slowly. One winter evening they sat together outside a small cafe. Snow drifted softly through city lights. For several moments they watched people walking past. Then Elena suddenly asked, "Can I ask something?" Adrian looked toward her. "Anything." She looked ahead quietly. "Why didn't you see me before?" Silence. Adrian smiled sadly, because he had asked himself that question 1,000 times. Then he looked at her, directly at her. "Because I never imagined you'd stop looking at me." Elena stared at him, and for a moment years seemed to disappear between them. Years of waiting, years of silence, years of missed chances. Slowly, very slowly, Elena reached for his hand. Adrian looked down, then back at her. This time there was no uncertainty, no assumption, no taking her for granted, because this was different. Years ago, Elena had loved him while waiting to be chosen. But now, she held his hand because she wanted to. because now Adrian had finally learned what love actually meant. And for the first time in their lives, they chose each other at the same time.